Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Old School RuneScape Retrospective series. If this is your first time watching, I recommend going back to the previous episodes to catch up on the topics we've covered so far. In this episode, we'll finally take a look at Old School RuneScape's music catalog and sound profile as a whole, talk about the various stages of accounts one may find themselves in and the content to do within them, and finally take a look at some of RuneScape's more mechanically inclined combat. In Old School RuneScape, and essentially every game ever made, we have background music. The music features no vocals, with the exception of using vocals as instruments within some tracks at the Theater of Blood. The music in Old School RuneScape, to me, doesn't serve as a tool to necessarily draw us into the world, but is instead a tool by which the player is told a story about where they are. When you're in Prifddinas, the crystal city of the elves, the song Dance of the Mylir is very light and whimsical and features a beautiful piano lead and chime work in the background, which almost sounds like a musical twinkle or the shimmer of a crystal somehow turned to sound. By contrast, in Keldagrim, the home of the dwarves, we hear the song Tale of Keldagrim. We hear a much stronger prominence of bassy drums behind synthetic horns. While in Keldagrim, you just feel like you're in a working man's town. The horns remind the player of the hustle and bustle of everyday work and this large-scale sense of industry, while still maintaining a cheery overtone as to not sound overbearing. The music in RuneScape's overworld is typically very jaunty adventure music with hints and themes of whichever area you're in helping to tell the tale. The overworld is whimsical and inviting to curiosity, while the underworld, such as the Underground Pass, is very foreboding and cautionary. Long, haunting organ tones with upbeat highlights in the background prove an interesting mix, one that suggests to the player that some lumbering beast is lurking, or that a challenge is to be faced, but still leaves them feeling like it can be overcome. Even if the tracks are supposed to be scary and tell the audial story of terror, there are still sections where it sounds and feels like the hero's triumph. Even if it then cascades back into forbearance, the hero, and often the player, gets to feel like their part of the story is being told. The story of the bold adventurer braving the horrors of the darkness and overcoming evil. In this way, I feel like RuneScape does a spectacular job at sucking the player in while also telling a story. With music, you can essentially get someone to tell themselves a story, but you're just giving them the inspiration. As far as music goes, if it's something you enjoy, you won't ever run out of tracks to listen to at any time soon, as Old School RuneScape has 795 individual music tracks, with the shortest being 1 minute and the longest being 11, and most sitting around the 3 to 5 minute mark. Now, it's true that if you're doing something sedentary, like woodcutting for example, you're going to be listening to the same tracks over and over, and I feel like Jagex could do a better job at letting the tracks breathe a little more before beginning the next. Furthermore, while I feel like Jagex purposefully takes special attention to the tracks they know players will be listening to while skilling in the same spot for what could be hundreds of hours, if they gave them just a bit more breathing time in between, you could extend the life of someone's enjoyment of your song by several hours. It may seem like I glanced over the amount of music in Old School RuneScape, so let me reiterate for clarity. There are 795 music tracks in Old School RuneScape at the time of recording. That is more music than likely your favorite 10 artists combined. To my knowledge, Old School RuneScape has the most original music of any video game ever made. Now, to that same point, abundance isn't always a positive trait, as I do have something to say on our vast quantity here. The region for which music is played is too small, resulting in what can be at best jarring and at worst obnoxious moments in the listening experience. For example, if you've ever done barrows while you had the music on, you probably just forgot to turn it off. And the reason for that isn't because the music is bad, but more so because when maneuvering from one crypt to the next, You hear the same flute flutter as the song Dance of the Undead restarts each and every time you resurface. I know that you can simply turn off the music to get around this, but the music is one of my favorite aspects of this game, and I don't want to have to not listen to any because there's a poor system in place for playing it. That being said, let's take a look at a really cool feature on the wiki that can help to demonstrate my point. On screen is the music map. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to mess around with it, but it shows all the regions in the game where each music track will be played. Looking at Camelot in particular, a player who has just teleported to Camelot and is now walking to Ardoin will end up listening to the start of 6 or more music tracks depending on their route. And again, while I think the music in RuneScape is beautiful, I'd love to be able to hear the tracks at a little more length while I adventure about. For all that could be said about the music as you traverse the world, I also have to touch on its replayability. Now, while it's true that you'll almost never have a game that has music with the same replayability as your favorite band's best album, I'll say, at least to me, old-school RuneScape's music comes close. I'll admit that I'm biased in this regard, as I've always been incredibly fond of the music and sounds of this game. As a child, they were new, and as an adult, nostalgic. While I don't think nostalgia was ever in the minds of the songwriters, it can't help but be felt, as I'm helplessly transported to the easier days of childhood through my ears. Anyway, while the music in RuneScape may never have the same replayability as something like Kendrick Lamar's Not Like Us, you'll definitely latch onto a few favorites in no time and probably find yourself humming them to yourself from time to time as well. Furthermore, something I don't think I've seen in any other game, is that the UI has a tab dedicated solely to the music player. With a game with this vast a collection, it seems appropriate to have a hub for it, but on the main UI, where you also have your inventory, prayers, and spellbook, always seemed like a strange call to me. Maybe it's just a relic of when the game was designed that no one really ever questioned, but it always felt strange to me regardless. Anyway, with as many songs as old-school RuneScape has, again a staggering 795, you can imagine there are a few duds in the mix. Maybe I'll catch some heat for this as a hot take, but the very first time I heard Country Jig, I was taken aback so hard I almost fell out of my chair laughing. The country tune felt so wildly out of place that it was all I could focus on. I didn't even remember what I had come to the area for. And it's not even that the area didn't fit with the theme or the environment that it was in, but the song, to me, feels so starkly not RuneScape, but it couldn't help but be stunned when I heard it for the first time. You may be able to tell where this sits on the replayability scale for me. As mentioned earlier, the song Dance of the Undead doesn't even give you a chance to enjoy it before you find it so grating that you just turn it off, and the worst part about this is that it would probably be a fairly easy fix, just don't have the song change for every crypt entrance and resurfacing, or make the whole of Barrows a 1 or 2 song area. Dance of the Undead for the overworld and the crypts, and Dangerous Way plays while you're in the tunnels beneath the crypts. Though I'm sure there would be some sort of weird spaghetti code that would for some reason spawn a T-bow at the farming guild again, so best leave it alone. With that being said, let's take a look at the sounds in old-school RuneScape, and we'll start with a look at the sliders, or better yet, a demonstration of what the slider actually means. Here, you can see the slider is broken into 3 sections: music, sound effects, or sounds you or the thing you are interacting with are making, and thirdly, area sounds. Taking a look at the numbers, you can see 1% is pretty docile, and you may even struggle to hear anything. 2% feels like a decent mid-range, and you can still hear what's going on, but still might be able to hear a show or a conversation in the background, while 3% and above feels like irreparable ear damage. While I know I'm exaggerating a bit here, ask any old school player and they'll tell you. They either play with sounds off wholesale, or play with them very, very low. The following clip is a demonstration of woodcutting in Draenor Village with the volume sliders up a quarter of the way. If that isn't completely and utterly off-putting, I don't know what is. While it certainly sounds believable that I'm chopping wood amongst 40 other people, all smashing their hatchets into trees nearby, but this is certainly an instance where realism leads to an unnecessarily unpleasant experience. And the problem here, just to clarify, isn't that I can hear everyone else woodcutting, but it's that unless I fine-tune my sound settings, I could get whiplash at how vastly different some sounds are in relation to others, so they're usually just on ultra-low to be on the safe side, as it can be annoying to fiddle with the sound settings depending on your activity if you enjoy the environment sounds in the first place. I understand that sound is going to come through different for everybody, depending on your output device and system settings, but on every computer I've ever owned, hell, even on mobile, sound is going straight to 2%. Aside from the way they're presented, let's take a look at the quality of RuneScape sounds. Ooh, sorry about that. Oh god, how did that get in here? Sorry, just getting in some plank making. So, as you can probably tell, RuneScape has a very, very unique sound profile. The sounds in this game fall somewhere between realistic and stylized, but hit a charming balance in the middle. For the most part, the sounds are pretty guiltless and provide clear feedback to what the player is seeing. Though I will say I feel that some of the sounds fall a little flat, the Dragon Warhammer for example. What should sound like a small calamity crashing into Earth from the heavens actually ends up sounding like a paperback book hitting the floor in the other room. But, by contrast, the Bandos Godsword special attack sound. Now that sounds impactful, that just sounds sharp. And that's just the thing, while the sound effects mostly sound fine, not too many that are objectively egregious, but they feel pretty inconsistent in terms of how they land. When an enchanted ruby bolt procs its special effect and makes this noise, I both know I'm doing damage because I know what the effect is, but I also feel like I'm doing damage because I can hear the effect of my attack. Big numbers aren't the only thing that makes a player feel powerful. For example, here's a clip of a player using the Dragon Warhammer special attack, but we'll try using our own sound effects to see how they land. Which sounded like it hit harder. Audio feedback is very important underlying context that helps us believe in what we're seeing, and when the sounds don't match with what we're seeing, we get this odd dissonance that feels really unsatisfactory. Among sounds that feel like they don't quite fit their aesthetic or description, we also have some sounds that just straight up don't make sense to me at all. The Abyssal Bludgeon, for example. There's zero chance you can convince me this thing weighs less than 60 pounds, or 27 kilograms for the rest of the world, but also sounds like this. I don't know what slapping something with the fleshy, weaponized spine of a demon should sound like, but I know damn well that ain't it. RuneScape does a good job at presenting its sound for the most part, but could certainly stand to be given a once-over in the consistency department. While I feel like I've made my point with music and sound, and I already know this is going to be a long episode, we'll go ahead and move on to our next topic for today, account stages. Now, this may seem like kind of an abstract topic if MMOs aren't exactly your cup of nettle tea, but you'll often find when playing them that you can slot yourself fairly neatly into one of three categories: early game, mid game, and late game. I want to now discuss these stages of the game as they present themselves within old-school RuneScape and how Jagex has done at giving each group of players something to do within them. Starting first, as we all do, we'll start in the early game. We'll consider the early game anything up to starting to gear up for and experiment with things like Scurrius, Barrows, and getting your Barrows gloves. And here is somewhere I actually think Jagex captured lightning in a bottle. It's hard for me to say exactly what it is. Maybe it's the rapid progression in the early game that comes with years of experience that gives me such a serotonin boost, but knocking out quests in the early game, getting 15 to 20 levels in skills you haven't even touched yet, simply kicks ass, to put it frankly. You'll hear many people say it, veterans of the game especially. If they could go back and experience the early game without everything they know now, they'd do so in a heartbeat. Whether that's due to a sense of longing for a bygone time, i.e. the innocence of our childhoods as a whole, or we truly just loved to experience the world of Gielinor when we didn't know its limits, one couldn't necessarily say, but I'd wager it's a mixture of the both. The early game in RuneScape is largely going to depend on what your intentions for your account are, as some people may make an account solely to PvP, or others to stay at level 3 combat and only level their skills. That being said, there's a myriad of activities for you to dive into, and it won't take you very long to get started. Knocking out the free-to-play quests is something that an experienced player can knock out on day 1 in a few hours, or might take a new player a few days to weeks depending on their available playtime, knowledge, and experience with the genre. That being said, even when a player has knocked out all the free-to-play quests, they can start moving on to some of the members' quests with no requirements that yield large XP rewards to further accelerate their levels and bypassing hours of training. At this stage in the game, the player is mostly knocking out quests, or they're tucked away leveling up their skills for quest requirements. While some account builds will forego quests due to their own self-imposed restrictions, questing is going to be the main vehicle by which a player progresses the quickest. For example, one could sit down and fish for 2 hours and go from 1 to 24, or you could take 30 minutes or so, get 30 fire making, and do the Sea Slug quest, which takes all of 10 minutes, and get 24 fishing that way. A player could level their rune crafting by running back and forth from altars for a few hours, or you could do the Eyes of Glofri quest at level 1, resulting in level 22 rune crafting, then go do the Temple of the Eye quest, which also requires Enter the Abyss mini quest, full disclosure, and be sitting at 28 rune crafting and have nary crafted a rune, and furthermore, have access to a minigame that makes the skill tolerable. That actually brings us to another great point of the early game, and while they really could go anywhere, they feel most right here: minigames and skilling activities. Usually with a barrier of entry set at around 40 or 50, depending on the activity, players can take on various skilling-related minigames or diversions that shake up the normal experience of training. Wintertot allows the player to primarily level firemaking, with token amounts of XP in woodcutting, fletching, and construction. For fishing, you can go out on a trawler ship and help upkeep it with other players for some fish and most notably the angler outfit, or take on Temperos, where players take on a giant water monster by firing sharp fish at it for fishing XP. Because that makes sense. For mining, you have things like Motherlode Mine, which act as a less attention-intensive training method, or Falling Stars, where the player traverses the world looking for fallen stars and mining them with other players for stardust, which is another relaxed activity. On the PvM side of things, the early game actually has decent representation, with 7 bosses that I'd say are concretely early game, with really little to no mechanics to speak of and fairly low combat level. These bosses are Obor, Bryophyta, Scorius, the Barrows Brothers, the Deranged and Crazy Archaeologists, and the Chaos Fanatic. Most of the early game, to be honest, is going to be preparation for what has yet to come. You'll take your first steps into quest lines that run through the end game, unlock travel, get your toes wet with your first bits of PvM and those wacky things called mechanics, and start to notice and learn more of the nuances of the timing of the game. When you get to the mid-game, you've likely gotten yourself some Barrows gloves, which means having gotten 175 quest points, and your first, or likely several, level 70 skills, and are starting to look towards generating some GP, progress further into endgame quest lines, and start to take on more menacing bosses. If this is your first account, and frankly, even if it's not, you're going to be in the mid-game for a long, long time. That's kind of just the nature of the game. The mid-game is largely centered around combat, where you'll start taking on Slayer if you haven't already. Dagonoth Kings and Perilous Moons will net you your first serious nest egg of cash, where you'll start to realize just how quickly you can generate it with focus, but also just how quickly it will deplete when you start to invest it in your more costly buyable skills such as Herblore, Construction, and Prayer. You'll likely spend a lot of your time at the aforementioned skilling activities, doing clue scrolls, bossing, and trying to hit new gear milestones to prepare yourself for the endgame. In RuneScape, at least nowadays, there's decent representation for all gear levels, but truth be told, most of your differences are going to start around the 50s because before that, you're leveling and changing gear so quickly that I can see the lack of desire to design a ton of content for that space, as there was already more than enough to get you along. That being said, As you edge yourself in the 70s and 80s for combat, you'll start looking to get your first pieces of gear that are going to cost you millions each, such as upgrading your Trident of Seas to a Toxic Trident, as well as getting a blowpipe and a zombie axe to name a few staples. As I said, a player is going to be in the mid-game for a long time. Mid-game itself could almost be subdivided into categories such as early mid-game and end mid-game, which I know might sound absurd, but just follow me here. As far as progression goes, I think we've made the point that RuneScape sits in a class of its own in terms of slow burn. Largely depending on your playtime, you could be within the mid-game for months or even years. In WoW, for example, you'll likely have leveled a character or two to max by the time you've maybe leveled a skill to 99 in RuneScape. And this isn't a comparison to take a jab at WoW, but more so to exemplify that when time is concerned, we're talking about something else altogether. You can raid in the mid-game, you can have 99s in the mid-game, and this isn't to project some concept of classism or elitism, it's just an arbitrary state of account, really. I would consider this portion of the game to be the meat and potatoes, if you will. It's got the main course, it's what you came for, it's the content with your friends, if you have any. It's making money, it's leveling your skills, it's bossing, it's clues, and most of all, you're preparing for endgame. Now, I'm certain others are going to have a varying opinion on when one enters the endgame, but I'd say you've squarely hit the endgame when you have max combat stats, maybe a few other 99s, and roughly 2,000 total, most or all quests complete, and are fairly familiar with most of the standard bossing mechanics the game throws at you and are starting to take on endgame challenges such as the Inferno and the Colosseum. The endgame is where a player really starts to zero in on maxing out their stats and their account to attain the max cape, an item coveted by sweat lords of all nations, start to round out their gear and collect their best in slots, complete combat achievements, amass vast amounts of wealth, or at least try to, hunt for pets, or at least try to, and fill out the collection log. And while a lot of this may seem vaguely superficial, in that none of these activities other than maxing really benefit you in any discernible way, I feel like a lot of the endgame is about skill expression and personal progression. You're going to be setting a lot of your own goals, hitting them, and then repeating. And as a late game player, it can actually sometimes be difficult to nail down what to do, because without a clear indication of what you should be doing, like leveling up your skills, it can often feel like what you're doing will amount to no ends and feel like a waste of time. Maybe this is the jaded opinion of someone who's been scorned by the natural force that is RNG, but when many of your goals, and remember this is coming from the perspective of a maxed Iron Man, when many of your goals are RNG-centric, such as boss drops or raid loot, it can be very demotivating to go try for an item and change the nature of your desire to do anything. And again, I'm more than willing to call this my own biased opinion based on my own terrible luck, but I remember before I was maxed thinking about how much PvM I would engage in and how much fun it would be to do nothing but boss for loot all the time. And then I got my max cape and it actually came time to do it. And I can't really describe it, but it felt like the steam wasn't all there the way it had been before, I guess. The reality of actually bossing for hours on end with no discernible end in sight, knowing I'm no closer this kill than I was when I started, and the thought of how many more bosses I have to take on for gear I don't have, and end up going into a black hole thinking about supply cost, time spent, frustrations of dying because bad, and my expectations of fun quickly diminish. The endgame kind of feels like going off to college if the midgame is like high school. You meet all your friends in high school, if you have any, experiment and learn new things together, grow together, make some money, do some bosses together, and then you graduate high school and head off into the endgame. Well, you don't want to go to college, but maybe your friend wants to go to college and max. You'd rather stay in your hometown and dive straight into raids because when am I going to use agility in the real world? So you don't really see him anymore and you have to learn to solo raid because raids are XP waste now. Once you get to the endgame, a lot of the friends you made along the way may stop where they are or push themselves to learn new content and continue to grow as a player. Some may steer heavily into skilling and wrapping up 99s, others are cool with 70 skills and maxed combat and going for combat achievements. Everyone's going to end up in a different spot when they get here, but the pathway here is fairly universally standard, I'd say. With all that being said, I think we have a fairly solid understanding of what one might end up doing in the various stages of their accounts, so we'll go ahead and move on to what might end up being the longest section of this video, PvM and Mechanics, and how Jagex implements difficulty into such a unique game. I'm really excited to talk about this, as combat is my favorite activity in the game, bossing and raiding specifically, so please don't let the monotone voice convince you otherwise. Now, it's no secret that 90% of combat in old-school RuneScape is fairly dull and/or straightforward, as it was based on old-school RPG elements. Initiate combat with thing, numbers in the background roll your stats versus the other thing's stats, roll high enough and you deal damage, roll too low and the enemy defends your attack. Repeat until one of you dies. Fairly straightforward stuff. What you might not know is that underneath its fantasy RPG setting lies one of the best disguised rhythm games ever made. We'll touch more on the concept of rhythm here shortly, but keep that in mind. When OldSchool RuneScape first released, our only options as far as endgame content goes was Barrows Brothers, simply pray the correct thing, Calfight Queen, pray the right thing but this time it can hit you a bit through prayer, and then the Fight Caves, which upon release was actually a decently formidable challenge. While to some the Fight Caves are a walk in the park, for the uninitiated, it's a daunting step up from what we might have seen so far. 63 waves of increasingly difficult monsters culminating in your face-off against Tizok Jad, the first time we see this kind of call and response style of combat. Through Jad's animations, we're given an indication of what attack he's going to use. He'll rear up on his hind legs and fire a magic shot, or he'll slam his front legs down, causing a ranged attack to hit you. And upon seeing him start his animation, you have 4 ticks, or 2.4 seconds, to identify his attacks and pray accordingly. Furthermore, at sub 150 health, Jad will spawn healers that you will have to tag off of him while still dealing with his attacks. After the player has done so, they can finish the fight. In comparison to the other 2 pieces of content we have at the time, the Fight Caves is actually a pretty decent step up in difficulty. Now, while it's true that a prepared player is going to encounter very little issues in the Fight Caves if they have a plan and know what's going on, I think a lot of us might forget how long it took to get to that level of proficiency. It often takes players several hours to reach Jad for the first time, depending on their weapon and stats. Imagine this. You've just got off work. It's late. You sign into RuneScape to try and get your fire cape again. You've spent 2 hours with your trusty rune crossbow working your way up to wave 63. Jad spawns. Your heart rate increases. You're attacking Jad and things are going alright. Your hands are kind of clammy, but you maintain your sweaty grip on the mouse. This is the time you get your fire cape. The healers are coming out now. You tag them. 1, 2, 3. A mage attack is coming. No, it's a range. You just missed your prayer. You take a 97 straight to the forehead. You collapse to your knees as the familiar jingle plays. The Tizar outside the cave tells you that you fought well, Jaliet. You collect your pity coins and head back to the bank. A sick feeling in your stomach and a groggy feeling in your head as the adrenaline is replaced with frustration and disappointment. You log out. You click 1 star because you did in fact not have a good time today. It's time for bed. You are a machine that turned 2 hours of concentration and effort into 0 progress. This machine has run the same routine the last 3 days and the cogs are growing weary. You are me trying to get my first fire cape. While that may seem like an exaggeration to some, I guarantee there are some of you that felt that on a spiritual level and can relate wholeheartedly. Anyway, this, the Fight Caves, was our capstone for a while. And while that story does a good job depicting a new player's trials through the caves, an experienced player is going to be left looking for something with a little more depth. 10 months after the game's release, the peak of our content was re-released in the form of the God Wars Dungeon. This new old area let players dive into the frozen earth north of Borthorpe into the never-ending War of Old to take on the then 4, now 5 God Wars generals. While we had Dagonoth Kings in the game at this time, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this is the first instance of bossing where the player is explicitly required to be under the attack of multiple combat styles in the form of both the bosses themselves being capable of multi-styling, but also their 3 minions, each using a unique combat style. As referenced before, we already had the Dagonoth Kings, but you can single them out easily enough that it doesn't really count to me. Players experiencing the God Wars dungeon for the first time might be very surprised at just how quickly they can get stacked out for damage if they're unprepared or unalert. This is one of the first instances where the player might be considering what armor they're wearing, and not just for the offensive bonuses, but this is where we might see players using, for example, dragon hides instead of more traditional tank gear or offensive gear, as they're more concerned with magic defense, which D-hides, Carols, and Masori all cover in spades. Decisions like this, and naturally your access to various ranges of gear, and often having to make do with what you have, is one of the many ways Jagex adds little layers of complexity during the fights. As far as mechanics go, there's not really much to speak of here in terms of developer-intended mechanics. I could go over things like the door alter methods, but that's not the sort of complexity I want to cover in this video, as it's a player-designed method to deal with developer-designed attacks, and I want to focus more so on Jagex's intention and vision of a particular boss, and less so the varying ways a player can mitigate them, though some notable methods will be brought up. Carrying on, God Wars itself, aside from making it so the player is under fire from multiple threatening enemies and varying attack styles, doesn't actually add very much mechanically to the overall pool. Other than perhaps Kriara, who demands that the player maintain their attack aggression on him as to not provoke a strong melee attack, and Kriltsutsaroth's prayer-draining ability which cuts your prayer in half, meaning it's best to monitor it and keep it low without letting it fall off. While these aren't strictly necessary to bear in mind, maybe more so the Kriara one is, you're going to be fine for the most part by just keeping your health above 60 and whacking the boss. Commander Zilyana, on the other hand, is actually pretty cool. At first release, there were methods where players in a duo or more would share the tanking responsibility and let Zilyana chase you around the room while your teammate beats her up with Varix, and when she turns around, rinse and repeat. Or, if you were solo, you much more likely ran around the room taking well-timed crossbow shots. Other than potentially using Chinchompas to deal with Kriara, this is one of the first opportunities players would have to start to fine-tune their movement and timing skills. Moving around the room and taking shots without missing ticks and simultaneously avoiding her melee attacks is something that takes time and practice, but is fairly achievable for most players. And furthermore, I think is one of our first mechanics, if you can call it that. Avoid being in melee range of the boss, and you avoid her damage altogether, leaving you to only have to deal with the minions. On the 10th of April, 2014, we'd receive our first unique Slayer bosses to OldSchool RuneScape, the Kraken and the Thermonuclear Smoke Devil. Unfortunately, neither of these really contributed to the mechanic pool. The Kraken is just wear magic defense and use mage, and Thermi kinda just comes down to using Redemption or Phoenix necklaces to mitigate his low hitting but constant stream of damage. Later in October of the same year, we'd receive our next boss, the Corporal Beast. This doesn't really count as a new boss as it's a backport from the original game, but we can take a peek anyway. Corp's only real gimmick is that he's weak to spears and only weapons classified as spears, but furthermore he has this dark core that will spawn during the fight and jump to players. Other than Zilyana, this is our first instance of combat where players may find themselves moving consistently, or moving in a sequence to deal with a mechanic. I tell you all of this to give you a solid baseline into understanding what was considered difficult at the time, and give you context for how difficulty developed over time, and how Jagex got better at teaching the player. It's early January 2015. You log into RuneScape to see a new boss has just dropped, Zulrah. You know your way around the game. You've been around the block before. You have a fire cape after all. Lord knows it took 13 attempts, but you got there. You head over to the swamp and prepare to take on the new beast, not knowing what to expect. You proceed to get absolutely fucking steamrolled for 14 hours straight, before knocking the snake back into whence he came for the first time. Zulrah, from what we've seen, is maniacally difficult by comparison. With Poison Clouds, we have to remember the patterns of 4 different sequences of phase changes to memorize, all with different positions and attack styles we need to be in and using for each phase. We're using multiple combat styles for the first time. We're having to pray against mage and range attacks in sequence in what we call a Jad phase in reference to the back and forth use of 2 styles. There is a lot to be asking the player to be learning all at once, and it often leads to the situation I had where I rammed my head into the snake-shaped wall for over half a day. And hey, I'm bad at the game, I get it, but at the same time, the game did absolutely nothing to prepare me for any of these mechanics. This is the first time we're dealing with a lot of these, and we're having to experience them both in tandem, but also in a dangerous environment. I'm not saying there should always be a training grounds by any means, but having lower level bosses with little hints of things higher level bosses do, you can slowly teach your player base to deal with mechanics one at a time before chucking them all in a blender and calling it Zulrah. With Zulrah, however, I think we truly see the emergence of a concept I touched on briefly earlier, call and response combat. I think combat in a lot of games can be broken down in this way, but I made a diagram to show how it expresses itself in RuneScape. From left to right, we can see we have call, response, and outcome. Games like Dark Souls do this really well, and often really rapidly, with bosses making many calls, or signals about what they're about to do, and the player has to react, or respond, accordingly in quick succession. For our example, we'll look at Zulrah and how his fight looks through this lens. On the left, we see his various calls, his signals to the player about what he's doing, and how the player has to respond, or face damage, often resulting in death. This type of graph can be made for just about every piece of content in the game. While outcome probably won't change very much, you can often gauge the difficulty of something based on how many calls and subsequent responses it's asking the player to memorize. Another layer of difficulty we find in combat is going to be found in the form of dealing with multiple calls or mechanics at once. A higher level PvMer named Adicon once described these as attention grabbers, or things that aren't necessarily difficult in isolation but are present to steal focus from the player and add mental clutter. A great example of this is in the Enrage phase of the fight that concludes OldSchool RuneScape's 3rd raid against Tumeken's Warden. As you can see, there's a metric fuck-ton going on here. The player has to deal with lightning strikes that threaten 90% or more of your available tiles to walk, range and mage attacks from the Ghost of Zebak on the left, avoiding falling boulders from the Ghost of Baba on the right, all while the floor is falling away from you and forcing you to a smaller and smaller area while trying to find the time to deal damage. Within this sequence of attacks, when done successfully, the player falls into a very natural rhythm, not only as to how they're moving and clicking, but also as to where they're looking on the screen for their information at any given time. Check prayer, check floor, move, attack, check prayer, check floor, move, attack, check prayer, check floor, move, attack, so on and so forth, and it becomes a very repeatable pattern that once you learn, feels rewarding to perform. It's like finally getting the hang of Guitar Hero and being able to turn up the difficulty and use the orange button and just pretend a little bit more believably that you have talent. The punishment, however, for falling out of rhythm is very harsh, depending on how long you were out of sync and if you were able to recover at all. The difficulty often isn't just with making things go right, but recovering from your mistakes without dying when things go wrong. In recent years, with each boss that continues to come out, Jagex does a great job at taking mechanics from more end-game-centric content and singling it out as a core mechanic of a lower-level boss. Scurrius, for example, teaches the player about identifying an attack and praying accordingly, as well as dodging falling objects. These mechanics we'll see in countless boss fights throughout the game. The Leviathan, for example, is almost solely these mechanics, but the punishment is cranked way up, as well as the speed. But in the low-level environment of the Scurrius fight, The punishment for failing to adequately respond to those mechanics is a lot less severe, and the amount of things the game is asking of the player is also limited and the pace is slowed down to give them proper time to see and process the calls and respond accordingly. Another example of this is when fighting the Eclipse Moon of the Perilous Moons activity. One of the special attacks he performs is summoning an orb where the player has to walk around the arena, keeping the moving orb between themselves and the boss. This is a great reference to an earlier released piece of content you may have heard of, the Inferno. To cap off the 69 waves of the Inferno, you face off against Tizkal Zook, where much like the Eclipse Moon fight, you protect yourself from Zook's attacks by pacing with the moving shield, among other things. It's noteworthy enough to mention, I think, that while obviously conceptually they're similar, they even move at the same pace, which I think helps to build muscle memory and familiarity with the concept of moving cover, so that your first experience with it isn't at the end of a 2.5-hour run, where one mistake and you get mollywopped for a 124 to the face and learn nothing. Again, we see a lower level environment mirroring the concepts and mechanics of a higher level content to better familiarize players with what they can expect later, and I just wish Jagex had this idea in mind back when they started to release new content for the game. But hey, better late than never. Other notable combat mechanics we'll find in-game are things like Kefri's dung walls within the Tombs of Amasket, where she'll force the player to leave behind a large trail of impassable dung, in turn terraforming the room and limiting the player's movement. This especially becomes a potential problem when you need to kill a scarab that maneuvers throughout the arena, where failing to deal enough damage results in big damage for all players present. Or when fighting the Whisperer after the Desert Treasure 2 quest, having to travel to the Shadow Realm to observe the calls there that you otherwise can't see, but don't stay too long, otherwise you'll run out of sanity, forcing you to teleport out or die. One more boss fight and we'll start to wrap things up. During While Guthic sleeps, the player faces off against Surok, a powerful mage. Surok features several mechanics that we don't see anywhere else in the game, and it would be criminal to not mention them. During the fight, he'll cast a really large, slow-moving spell at the player, where they'll have to use a spell of the opposite element to neutralize it. He'll also summon various NPCs to aid in his favor, whereupon you'll have to cast either Weaken on the strong warrior, or the spell Entangle on the agile warrior. But what I think is the coolest of them all is that when he says Magic Ignitus, where he just throws a literal bomb that, if allowed to detonate, will do huge damage regardless of where the player is in the room. To bypass this, the player has to telekinetic grab the fucking bomb and high elk it. I don't know who figured that out or how, because that's not anything we've seen in RuneScape before, and is just another interesting way to interact with what opponents are doing that I'd never even thought of before. In this sense, RuneScape isn't always a particularly difficult game, but one that requires a lot of trial and error to learn what responses matches what call, and the consistency and execution to be able to perform the knowledge you have to the best of your ability without succumbing to things like nerves or pressure. And I think this actually has a lot to do with why the fight caves feel so difficult for a first-timer. Nerves. It's not even necessarily the fight itself that's difficult, it's the context that you've just spent presumably a long time to get to that point, and the fear of making a mistake resulting in losing hours of progress.
No!
Yeah, that's weird.
Are you serious? No!
And the excitement of potentially achieving a goal you've been after for a while. Take the Jad fight out of the fight caves in isolation, explain it to a new player where they can retry upon death, and I bet they'd have it in a few minutes. Context is everything. With all that being said, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up today's video. I hope this has left you with a satisfactory understanding of music and sound in RuneScape, as well as an understanding at what you might be doing at various stages of the game, and what kind of mechanics await you to deal with as you start to get to that point in the game. I want to say a massive thank you to whoever has watched this far, Please don't forget to like the video if you in fact liked it, subscribe to stay up to date with the latest content, and hit the bell to be notified when the next episode drops, where we'll continue to talk about combat, but this time focus more on combat styles themselves, power creep and how Jagex has gone about avoiding it, and likely wrap it up with a look at one of the shorter storylines in-game and start moving in the more narrative direction. Anyway, thank you all again so much for watching and the support so far, and we'll see each other next time.